Let me circle back to something that you just said, which is you don't really believe there is an above, but maybe there is a side by side.
Yeah. Um, I don't know if it would help you to know sort of like where I'm sourcing my sort of quote unquote practice or lineages from, but we don't have to go into that right now. Something that has occurred to me over years of practice, and it's actually really fresh on my mind because I had uh, a practice dream. I don't know if you like, there's certain dreams you have when you have a dream practice. Um, Not a lucid dream practice, but more like a dream yoga, Tibetan Daoist yoga practice, where you open yourself up to dreams as a kind of teaching or a portent or divination. Like you look at it a little differently than just like, oh, I'm having my normal anxiety dreams. And then there's an opportunity for something else sometimes to happen. And so I had this dream recently on the vernal equinox night, which was like a practice dream, which is to say, a lot of this stuff, especially even talking about it, it can become abstracted from the visceral direct experience. It's like I'm now talking about a thing, and then you have an interpretation about my interpretation, and then like it becomes diluted in a sense. And I try to sort of bring it back to the core of the direct experience as much as possible. So I had this direct experience dream. And so I've been sitting with what that felt like and what that might have been and how that refines some of the way I kind of cosmologically conceptualize reality, right? Like how does this actually affect change in my paradigm or my perception, right? Because that's sort of the goal in all of these practices that I do is to actually change or decolonize perception itself, the act of perceiving, which is creativity and dreaming. Um, so, anyway, I had this dream, and I'm not going to go into the contents of the dream because I think it's a little too much right now. But um, downstream from that, I started to kind of recognize how often we place ancestors, the dead, in a kind of somewhere elseness. Like they're in the past, which is somewhere other than now in this concept we have about the past, or like above or below, right? It's like heaven and hell, which are sort of like useful symbolisms, but I think they miss a kind of relational accuracy to the whole deal. So I've been saying it's a little bit like an overlay. Instead of a past, future, above, below kind of separation, imagining it like happening like if we played two films at the same time on the same projector, right? And then you can multiply that into infinity. But even if we just take that basic concept and feel what that feels like, imagine we were watching two films and they were like, two films you really liked or whatever, but you're watching them simultaneously. How that would sort of change, your brain would go, and you'd have to like relax and you'd have to also like recognize that you weren't going to see things the same way because as we know, when you overlay one pattern with another, a third pattern emerges that can't be seen from just one or the other. So that kind of complexity, I think, is the actual reality we're actually in, where ancestors are happening now, but that also means potential descendants are happening now. Like there is no not now, but it's just a way to sort of conceptualize it a little bit, maybe artistically for people so that we can actually get the felt sense of it rather than like constantly abstracting this idea of time, right? It's like it's like there's a whole thing to unpack there, but I find it useful to just bring myself back to this overlay concept that all the ancestors, all of them, even including non-human, more than human ancestors, are happening in a simultaneity. And that actually helps me practice relationally better than this kind of, I have to go to another place. I have to journey to another realm. It's like I've been gifted with enough experiences and practice that I can see the kind of trick of that languaging and how it's useful at a certain point in your practice. But then you get to another point in your practice, maybe like decades later, and you're like, that story is not nourishing anymore because it's fundamentally inaccurate to the experiences that I'm actually having. And yeah, so that's sort of the vibe I'm trying to bring is like, we want to bring people along for this ride, but I think it does a disservice to people when we constantly treat people like very much like children. Like even when we treat children like children, it's a bit of a disservice. It's like they could go farther if you just gave them the grace to be like, let me speed it up for you. And if you need to rewind, we can do that. And I think a lot of people, a lot of children, a lot of just people would be able to go, okay, I got that part, but let's focus. I don't understand this part yet. And it's like, great. But it's almost like you skip to the end of the Wizard of Oz. You're like the wizard, there's a guy behind the curtain. Now we can start talking. um, and we can kind of go back to Dorothy thinking there's a magic guy in the sky. Of course, we can do that, but I've just found it very useful to try to start as close to the finish line as possible, whatever
Hmm.
that finish line is.